Hello, students. I hope you all are having a good weekend. As promised, I'm going to deliver a quick little lecture here on a detailed study of Part 1, just to cover some of the important qualities that you all presented to me in the rest of the class earlier this week, but I also want to make sure that this lecture covers elements that perhaps weren't covered, so that way we have a fuller understanding of Part 1 as we venture into Parts 2 and 3 of the novel. If you guys have any questions, please make sure that you write these down somewhere or you are able to record them in some way so that way we can bring them up in class and address them, as I want to make sure that we fully understand what's going on in this book so far. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through each section that I assigned each group to present to us, and then I'm going to offer my own insight. And the way I've developed it is I have mini thesis statements for each section that I've created, and then some quotes that I think that are important for each of those particular sections, and I'm going to try my best to kind of talk through some of those quotes. And hopefully I'm clear. You'll have to excuse me as my voice is kind of giving out, so I may pause. Forgive me. First section we're going to talk about is Denver's birth. Denver, when we first meet her in the novel, is, if we remember this, is kind of meek and kind of awkward, unsure of her place at 124, and is consistently questioning where she comes from, specifically where Setha comes from. If we revisit the birth with a critical eye, we can see that Morrison's use of symbolism helps to link characteristics of Denver's birth with elements of the future, specifically Setha's future. Overall, Denver comes to represent that future, or at least what the future brings. More than that, she represents the future as it impacts Setha, and understanding Setha's present-day attention towards, or rather inattention towards Denver, will help us understand Setha's own thoughts and understanding in regards to that future. So one of the things I want to make sure that we touch on is this idea that Denver was born on the Ohio River. And while many of you unpacked that concept of water and kind of related it to beloveds walking out of the water, that was an excellent connection. Something else that I want to make sure that we understand about the Ohio River is that historically speaking, this was considered to be a spot where that helped define the territory in the United States where slaves were considered free and where they were considered slaves. So north of the Ohio River was territory that was free. South of the Ohio River was territory where slaves were considered to be slaves still. Okay, so it's extremely important to understand that Morrison had Setha have her baby right on the brink of this border. Okay, and if you remember, there was that quote that she said, "As soon as Setha got close to the river, her own water broke loose to join it." So that is specifically linking Denver's birth directly to this line that determines where a slave's freedom is truly acknowledged. Okay, so that's really important. The symbolism of that river is super important to understand. Okay, I think something else we need to understand is this connection between Amy and, as Setha calls herself, Lou, right? Particularly because this is sort of an unusual pairing in as far as that this is a white woman that has decided to stop Setha and help her out. And Setha, I think one group had said that she was on the brink of death, and that while she was pregnant, Denver, helped Setha survive. But more than that, it was Amy who kind of encouraged her, literally, and with her own language and thoughts, pushed Setha along so that way she could survive. And this relationship is something that we can't look over. We have to understand that not only is it unusual because it's a white woman helping a black woman, especially in this time period where that was highly unusual, but we also have to understand Morrison sort of wants us to look beyond the race at this point, right? That both of these women were on a particular mission to make sure that Setha was safe. More than that, that Setha gave birth to Denver, right? And that wouldn't have been made possible if it wasn't for the fact that they were isolated and together. And Morrison really wants us to understand that. And if we look at this quote, "On a riverbank, in the cool of a summer evening, two women struggled under a shower of silvery blue. They never expected to see each other again in this world, and at the moment couldn't care less. But there on a summer night, surrounded by blue fern, they did something together appropriately and well." This quote is really emphasizing the fact that both of these women were working on something together, and because they were by themselves, and because they were together, and because they were women, uninterrupted women at this point, they were able to accomplish this mission of delivering Denver. That's really important. As we continue to understand for whom this book is written, we can understand that Morrison is really trying to make sure that if we're trying to include all voices, particularly marginalized voices, that women become sort of a central focus, and that their work, women's work, is extremely important. Which is why, if you look very closely at the book, uh, we get many instances of Setha cooking or folding laundry or placating her daughters. Right, this is all considered to be quote unquote women's work, and Morrison really wants us to understand that more than race, it's this concept of gender that's tying Amy and Lou together. And Denver's name is sort of a symbol of that combination and sort of a manifestation of, a validation rather, of that a partnership between the two. Next thing I want to talk about is Paul D's slave experiences. When describing Paul D's slave experience, Morrison again utilizes multiple symbols to represent the atrocities from which Paul D has experienced and escaped. And through these symbols, she forces readers to reconsider slave conditions, not just as being mere atrocities within our history, but also as experiences that, if looked at in terms of beauty and the natural world, could potentially help heal the trauma one has experienced. So all of Paul D's experiences are somehow linked back, even though they are sort of horrible, they are somehow linked back to the natural world. And if we look closely at this natural world that Morrison is emphasizing to us, we can see that there's a particular mission she has in mind by making those elements of the natural world represent who Paul D is. So after Sweet Home, we understood that Paul D, he tried to escape. He was captured he was captured with many of his fellow slaves. All of them suffered different fates. Paul D's fate, he was sold to a plantation in Alfred, Georgia, where he was chained together with 46 other men, and not only were they chained together, but they were also caged together, right? One of the things we have to understand is that during this time, this was supposed to be a moment where that almost broke Paul D. While Sweet Home was awful when School Teacher came around, we're supposed to understand that Alfred, Georgia was even worse. We get specific elements when Morrison describes Paul D's experience. I forgot to include this in my lecture, but in one of my quotes, but I wanted to make sure that we understood. Paul D keeps referring to this iron bit, and what that iron bit was a specific device that was placed on his mouth as a slave in Alfred, Georgia, as he was chained together with these other men. And this iron bit was meant to keep them from speaking and make sure that their obedience was consistently contained. But it's this iron bit that sort of stretched out his jaw, and that taste that consistently kind of triggers many of the traumas and memories that Paul D has. So that iron bit becomes a specific symbol for those traumatic events that Paul D had in Alfred, Georgia. I also want us to understand that Morrison is she is very obvious with some of the events that took place in Alfred, Georgia, there are some elements that are not quite as obvious. And one of the things that I want to make sure, one of the subtleties of the traumas that Paul D experienced in his slave time in Alfred, Georgia, is that it comes from this specific quote on page 127. Kneeling in the mist, they waited for the whim of a guard or two or three, or maybe all of them wanted it. Occasionally, a kneeling man chose gunshot in his head as the price, maybe of taking a bit of foreskin with him to Jesus. I might have typed that wrong, I apologize. What I want us to understand here, I'm not sure anyone understands exactly what's going on here, but we're supposed to understand that every morning the slave owners in Alfred, Georgia would release these men, and as a sort of roll call, what they would be expected to do, or on the whim of any of these guards, they would be forced to give these guards oral sex, and that's actually what's going on here. And she's sort of using that image to represent how their not just sexual freedom was taken away, but how their total freedom was taken away, and how they were sort of humiliated by these slave owners on a completely different level. So that's just I want to make sure that we understand Morrison is not trying to hold back, that this is sort of a hyperbolic example of how the slave owners treated some of these slaves by debasing them and humiliating them in this particular instance. So when Paul D escaped, Alfred, Georgia, and it's really important that we remember. Oh, and I just want to go back real quick. We want to make sure that we understand that they escaped under the conditions of they all had to work together uh, to sort of dig themselves out of their cages during a long period of rain, and that idea of rain it becomes another symbol. If we link it back to how we've seen water in this book, that sort of rebirth and new beginnings. And it's this rain that becomes a symbol for allowing Paul D and his 46 companions to dig out of their cages and escape, right? So this is again another symbol um, that is tied to the natural world, that this rain is what's allowing Paul D to fully escape. When they escape, I don't know if anyone caught this, but they run into a group of Native Americans, which is actually a fairly interesting thing that Morrison is tying in. She's showing how two oppressed groups sort of have worked together, and it's with these interactions with the Native Americans that Paul D learns how to escape, and he learns how to escape from the chief of this Cherokee group of Indians because this chief tells Paul D to follow the tree blossoms, and if he follows the tree blossoms, he will end up in the territory where he'll be considered free and safe, right? And the tree blossoms become again sort of that another natural, another symbol that's rooted in the natural world, quite literally. The tree blossoms in this case represent sort of a path uh, of freedom. And tree blossoms, they seem to follow Paul D around quite a bit. He finds solace and comfort in trees. So it's only fitting that Morrison would offer a symbol like the tree blossoms as sort of Paul D's pathway and following of the trees in order to escape his slave experiences. And this is on page 133. Morrison lists all of the specific trees that Paul D follows on his way. Um, the other thing that we need to note with trees is that it's a mission of hers to sort of repurpose everything that was ugly, every kind of slave experience that was ugly, um, and try to make it sort of beautiful. Trees in this particular context. Um, oh, I'm sorry. Let me back up. Trees, if we think about historically in the African American context, have traditionally had sort of an ugly symbolism to them. Usually, trees signified lynching, where captors would capture other slaves and hang them from trees. And we can remember this. This is a specific image that Setha has when she's thinking about sycamores at Sweet Home. She sort of remembers her fellow slaves being hung from some of those trees. But here Morrison is taking that traditionally ugly outlook on trees, the symbolism that those trees have, and is turning it around into something beautiful. So, like I said, those tree blossoms become a path for Paul D, rather than keeping them as sort of that mind or that concept of a human beings hanging from them. She's now repurposing these trees as elements of freedom that former slaves would follow in order to get into their territories of freedom. And we can't help but remember the tree on Setha's back, right? It's actually a scar. But to call it a tree and to describe the blood blotting the cloth on her back as rose blossoms, as she does at one point in the book, is again proving that Morrison is on a mission to accept the ugly history of the past, but also repurpose it by making it more beautiful, right? Um, One last element. So the rooster that Paul D keeps talking about is also an element of the natural world that doesn't quite signify something beautiful, so it might be an exception to the thesis that I've put out there. But it's important to understand this rooster that Paul D calls Mister because um, this rooster represents the fact that there's an animal that he saw in Alfred, Georgia all the time that would sort of watch him with his own eyes and would force Paul D to understand that he was considered less than an animal, or could be considered less than an animal. And this rooster is supposed to symbolize sort of the fact that, uh, the fact that Morrison gave this rooster a name and sort of gave this rooster human-like qualities, a form of personification. We're supposed to understand that Paul D considered himself to be less than human, particularly when he looked at this particular rooster. So this rooster made him feel absolutely awful. And whenever he felt these sort of traumas, whenever he looked at Rooster, and whenever Paul D processed these different elements of slavery that he went through, Morrison talks about this other symbol of packing all of these concepts into the tobacco tin lodged in his chest. And by the time he got to 124, nothing in this world could pry it open. So this is an insight, this particular symbol of this tobacco tin inside Paul D's chest. We're supposed to think that Paul D's handling with trauma, he's taking all of these elements and packing them tight, not really fully exploring them, not fully confronting them or accepting them, but sort of hiding them away. And really important to note that by this last line of this quote I cited on page 133, by the time he got to 124, nothing in this world could pry it open. If we think about what happened when Beloved got a hold of Paul D, we actually start to understand this tin can is actually pried open, which speaks to the fact that perhaps Beloved is not quite from this world. Okay, so that's really important to understand. So those were some of the elements I wanted us to understand about Paul D and make sure that we had a full grasp. Next thing I want to talk about, Baby Suggs' freedom. And I just really want to cover some things quickly here. I don't have a lot that I need to say. Oop, pardon me. So Morrison's characterization of Baby Suggs as a former slave bewildered by her freedom demonstrates the impact this freedom can have on the thoughts of someone who has been enslaved all her life, therefore asking us as readers to reconsider the qualities of freedom that we often take for granted. And I think that when Morrison speaks to Baby Suggs' freedom, she's not just talking about this former slave who is really, primarily, when she first understands she's free, kind of bewildered at the fact that she's free or not quite understanding what it means to be free. Morrison's not only sort of unpacking this quality of Baby Suggs' character, but she's also forcing us as readers to ask that question, well, what does it actually mean to be free? We in 21st century America, I think, forget what that actually means. And we're supposed to be this land of freedom, land of opportunity. And I think Baby Suggs' character really is forcing us to truly contemplate what is freedom. One of the things that we understand is that Baby Suggs takes this freedom and she really makes something of it. This freedom becomes something other than just sort of circumstantial. It's not a fact that her son just bought her. What she actually understands is that this freedom is an opportunity for her to fully explore it internally, but then that's not enough. She also needs to share it with other people. And the way that she shares it, or the way that Morrison allows her to sort of share it, is through concepts of religion, right? Baby Suggs sort of becomes this new image of a preacher. Traditionally speaking, we think of preachers as, they're first of all men, and a lot of them at that time were white, right? So we're getting a completely different image of what a preacher is. And she doesn't have a church, it's not a traditional building. She has the woods, right? And again, that's sort of poking at the importance of natural imagery, natural settings in this book. So Baby Suggs has taken her freedom and sort of allowed herself to become this holy figure that many of the people in this village see as helpful in understanding their freedom. Something else I want to understand is that Morrison is also talking to the fact that freedom was something that you couldn't take for granted, and that there's another quote on page 103 where Morrison says, "She told them," Baby Suggs told her congregation, "that the only grace they could have was the grace they could imagine, that if they could not see it, they would not have it." And what I want to say here is that Baby Suggs is trying to get us to understand, or Morrison is trying to get us to understand through Baby Suggs, that freedom is a matter of the imagination. True freedom will allow you not only to imagine, but to fully enact on that imagination. So whatever freedom you can imagine, that's the first step. And Baby Suggs really becomes a vehicle for being able to understand that if you can imagine that freedom, you can do anything you'd like with that freedom. And so that's something that she is continuously trying to promote through her preaching. I also want to make sure that we understand that she's consistently in her congregation when she's preaching to her people. This is sort of where Morrison is allowing herself to speak to those voices in the margin, right? She's really trying. If you think about all of these speeches, all of these, I'm going to call them sermons because that's what they are, that Baby Suggs delivers. They're a call to make sure that these people understand that they are valid human beings and that their experiences are true, right? And she even says on page, Baby Suggs even says on page 114, you got to love it, and she italicizes the you. And she emphasizes on page 112, freeing yourself was one thing, claiming ownership of that free self was another, right? So that's really the whole context of Baby Suggs' character, is understanding the subtleties of that freedom. That yes, you can be considered to be free, but that's not enough. Since you are free, you are allowed to take ownership of that freedom. You are allowed to have that freedom. And that becomes crucial in understanding freedom as it is applied to individuals who are sort of robbed of that freedom. Not just in terms of this book, but if we think on a larger scale, especially in context of the lecture I just gave last class, in terms of being sort of robbed of our freedom if we are marginalized, being able that we can take control of ourselves if we can imagine our freedom. I'm going to pause this lecture. This is going to be part one of this lecture. I'm going to end it now, just for the sake of making sure I have enough video length. So continue on to part two.